All right, Brobs, I finally got this book in the mail after too many damn days. But let's get right to it. I got no time for this. We left off at the second part of chapter 1. It wasn't the second part, but the second part I read where whoever this guy is, Donald Westward's fossilization of reaction patterns in infancy. Clifford Allen points out that in certain societies, boys loiter in the stage of homosexuality until puberty, when they swing suddenly around to heterosexual activity, although retaining an active homosexual outlet. Boys and girls are more homosexual than heterosexual before puberty. It is at this time that interference may have some serious consequences, but a very large percentage of men who state that they are homosexual are merely immature and do not know how to help themselves to attain adult sexuality. I'll be honest. At no point in my puberty years was I homosexual. But there you go. I mean, it was not even a thought. It was girls, 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 everything. But okay, maybe I'm the weirdo. Again, to quote Dr. Dr. West, homosexual love is neither unnatural or incomprehensible, but simply immature. A halfway adjustment, intolerance, or a repressive attitude aggravates the situation by installing at an early age the fears and anxieties which lead to deviation. All the public debate about deviations and their dangers can increase anxiety, making adolescents scared and self-conscious about their emotions and giving parents a wider range of alarming prospects to fret about. The last sentence of Dr. West's book is, no doctor should advise a young person to rest content with a homosexual orientation without first giving a grave warning about the frustration and tragedy that so often attend this mode of life. Not only parents and schoolmasters, but those who campaign for the recognition of homosexuality as a normal, even a desirable way of life, might well be advised to read Dr. West's book. The normal or physiological phase of homosexuality in boys is recognized, understood, and encouraged in certain societies which we call primitive, but which seem to be free from much of the stress and anxiety associated with civilization. Graham Heath quoted from an important lecture by Dr. Robert Shields, a recognized authority on problems of adolescence, that the permissive society, with its emphasis on earlier casual sex, may deprive adolescents of this important period of emotional homosexual development, which should be a period of character consolidation, a time for identifying with one's own sex, of achieving a personal identity before moving on to genuine heterosexual encounters. If heterosexual performance is allowed to invade the homosexual phase, it does not happen that the individual becomes suddenly mature. What does happen, to judge from my clinical experience, is that homosexual ambivalences, hostilities, unresolved fears of the other sex, suspicion, and distrust are carried forward into later relationships. This, to me, is a novel and an extremely important point of view. Some 4 or 5 years before the Kinsey Report, an American psychiatrist writing of the panic fear of homosexuality among American parents attributed to it their habit of encouraging their sons to date girls at an age when healthy British boys are thinking predominantly about games. The immaturity referred to is usually emotional immaturity, but there may be some physical underdevelopment, especially small genitals, as Dr. Allen points out. There are a great many psychoanalytic interpretations bearing on the causation of homosexuality, but I do not intend to explore this territory. Those who want to know about the Oedipus complex and all that will have no trouble finding the information. There is one psychological influence so important and so generally accepted that it has been enshrined in the annals of modern graffiti. My mother made me a homosexual. Would she make me one if I gave her the wool? The fuck does that mean? the clinging kind of mother who seeks to entrench herself in her son's life and in his heart to the exclusion of other less secure love affairs. To make him a mother's boy probably does not provide the most potent type of maternal influence. There is general agreement with Freud, who found that when the father is weak or absent, and it is the mother who is the dominant parent, frustrating and punishing when required to the process of education, a boy is particularly liable to become homosexual. It should now be quite clear that many shades in the spectrum of sex color the picture of male homosexuality. It is far from being just a matter of the posturing, mincing individuals referred to as fairies or pansies, so often ridiculed on stage and screen. Although that type of man does tend today to parade his preferences more promiscuously than would have been possible some time ago, still less it is concerned with men who fall foul of the law by seeking physical relations with boys or youths. With such people, sodomy is probably less common than mutual masturbation and what is called coitus interfemoro. Homosexual practices are described in The Other Love by Montgomery Hyde. Improper relations with boys or young men are as repugnant to many homosexuals, possibly to the great majority of them, as they are to heterosexual people. However tolerant we may have become, I feel sure that the vast majority, whatever their sexual orientation, must feel an instinctive loathing for those who dare to parade their pedophilic preferences, who glory in and defend such practices, as opposed to those who seek treatment. It is for such creatures that I would reserve the term perverts. Ivan Bloch devotes a chapter in The Sexual Life of Our Time to misogyny. He refers to misogynists as a fourth sex. This curious idea is worth mentioning only because some of the men studied in this book were called misogynists. Although Bloch's outstanding misogynist is Euripides, he blames Christianity as the main source of misogyny. If he is right to do so, the chief blame must be laid on the shoulders of St. Paul, along with all those stripes. Perhaps he was a masochist. However, one might observe that it is in Muslim countries that woman is most definitely a second-class citizen. Various sexual deviations may be associated with homosexuality, though not necessarily confined to homosexual individuals. In paragraph 19 of Appendix 1, let's look at this appendix he keeps talking about now that I have a book on hand. I mean, this guy, well, why don't you just pass out the pamphlet with the damn book? There's Appendix 1. I'm not going through all this. Using the now rather outmoded term perversion, I advise that little should be said about these. Psychologists are not unanimous in their views about the connection between various deviations in homosexuality. Any of them may be encountered in heterosexual individuals, but often their presence may suggest some difficulty in achieving perfect adaptation to heterosexual relationships. Next to homosexuality and transvestism, the most common deviation is sadism, sexual arousal by cruelty, inflicting it, witnessing it, or even reading about it. An element of sadism is common in perfectly normal individuals, and it is only when it is extreme that one would call it a deviation of the sexual instinct. Flagellation has been called the English vice, presumably on account of the long tradition of corporal punishment in our schools. Some continental writers have also called homosexuality le vice anglais, though French writers call it le vice allemand. The tendency to attribute unnatural practices to foreigners is rather amusing. The contraceptive device, which we call a French letter, is known to the French as a caput anglaise. To the Victorian English, Paris was the Mecca for seekers after sexual delights. Although we tended to agree with the French that homosexuality is a German vice, our word bagger is derived from Bulgar. To the Germans, or at any rate to German writers, the sexual life of England has seemed particularly exciting. Ivan Bloch, a German, wrote a history of English sexual morals, 660 large and eminently skip-worthy pages, exceeded only by the 776 stodgy pages of the sexual life of our time. He was explicit about flagellation being an English, not a Scottish vice. and incidentally stated categorically that English women are the most beautiful in the world. In masochism, sexual pleasure is derived from being ill-used, and the practices to which such tendencies may lead are too fantastically varied to be described here. Masochism accounts for many possibly unintentional deaths, sometimes attributed to suicide, in which men or boys are accidentally hanged, or found dead, tied up in curious fashions. These two deviations are usually combined and known as sadomasochism. This fucking goes on forever. If one accepts that the belief that unkindness in general, saying nasty things about personal enemies and so forth, derives from sadistic impulses, it may be conceded that there is a bit of the sadist in most of us, though few are likely to feel moved to some of the extraordinary performances which are part of what is sometimes called kinky sex, misled by its title to expect that it had some bearing on the subject of this book. I read a study by two American psychiatrists and their research assistant of the sexual habits of American politicians up to and including presidents. The chapters about kinky sex are so nauseating that one can only echo the words, "No sex, please, we're British." But who can take seriously a scientific work which assures us on an early page that it has been declared a statistical fact that most women would rather go to bed with the President of the United States, whoever he may be, than with Robert Redford, whoever he may be. As a matter of fact, one can read about kinky sex in this country in the corresponding columns of such magazines as Forum and Penthouse, in which some letters sound more like descriptions of favorite fantasies than actual experience. It has been alleged that such letters may do harm by encouraging uninitiated readers to experiment in undesirable practices. On the other hand, they may help not only the writers by abreaction, getting it off one's chest, but some readers who may be glad to realize that they are not alone in their deviation. As in the case of my transvestite soldier, page 21. Some years ago, a correspondent in Forum described how in his service in the Navy he had been turned on by wearing shorts, and how he later had the same feelings when wearing the kilt. Clearly, bare knees associated with childhood appealed to the immaturity characteristic of many homosexuals. He ended his letter with a pathetic sentence, "I wonder if I am alone in my curious world," or something of that sort. A soldier to whom I refer in Chapter 2 had similar feelings. Steckel records similar cases in his book about psychosexual infantilism, such as that of a youth of about 18 who defiantly wore shorts long after his contemporaries had ceased to do so. Many of the more disgusting sexual kinks indicate, according to Steckel, the persistence of infantile sexuality. Obviously, the author is one of those few who read Playboy for the articles, even though the Forum was not necessarily an article. Exhibitionism, exposure of the person, as the law delicately calls the external genital organs, is essentially a malpreserve and is more common in men of weak sexuality, being often associated with impotence, as is sadism. Fetishism, a kind of compulsion neurosis, is often associated with homosexuality. It is predominantly a problem of men and involves a truly remarkable range of objects which can, in modern parlance, turn on the male. It has been said that there is scarcely a part of the body or an article of clothing which may not become the object of a fetish. If attachment to the fetish becomes obsessional, it may replace women as an object of sexual attraction. Steckel, who wrote voluminously about this particularly puzzling phenomenon, pointed out that whilst the essence of such a condition can be totally explained as a retreat from the female, flight from woman, it may form part of normal sexuality. It has long been recognized that some men are fascinated by certain features of a woman, the eyes, the hands, even the feet, and search for the perfect woman who embodies such features. Although this does verge upon fetishism, it is unnecessary to press the point. The influence on some people of leather clothing and of robber is widely recognized. I recall an occasion when a group of brother officers were discussing the case of a man who could have intercourse only on a bearskin rug in front of a log fire, and one of us, an officer of the Indian Medical Service, unexpectedly announced that he could perform only on a black velvet sheet. It had to be me who meekly asked if he was aroused when dressing for dinner. The facings of IMS mess kit were of black velvet. The true fetishist has his collections of symbolic objects, shoes, items of girls' underclothing, hair, especially in the days when girls' long tresses were surreptitiously cut off in public places. Such collections are sometimes referred to as a harem cult. Stealing such objects or publicly giving way to such compulsions as the desire to be trodden on by girls sometimes lead to conflict with the law. You think? Some years ago, the refrain of a popular song was often to be heard screeching from transistor radios and television sets about boots being meant for walking and the singer's intention to walk right over you. The anthem of one kind of fetishist. Other compulsions result in the apparently inexplicable, bizarre deaths, sometimes reported of which the victims are found chained or trussed, dressed in curious clothing and surrounded by various objects. The practice of masturbation with the aid of the fetish object may replace the need to develop normal sexuality. Fetishists are often cases of psychosexual infantilism. Thus, the connection with homosexuality is apparent. Steckel holds that there is an element of sadism or masochism in all cases of genuine fetishism. And I'll stop here at this point, not to end the chapter, but to make a point that many of the comments on the previous book that I did by the same author, Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor, most of the comments are from people who are like, this is an LGB rewriting of history. And if you really listen, these guys are not, well, this author is not, by his written admission, a particular fan of the movement, although some of his actions suggest otherwise, but he seems to call it an affliction. Fetishism reaches out in one direction to embrace not only the fairly common obsessions to which I have referred, but the strangest of compulsions for crippled women or crutches and such disgusting deviations as cannibalism, necrophilia, and vampirism. There I go. Count me in. Vampire girl. Just if she bit me, I would have to call the cops. Drew blood. Unpleasant practices which it is unnecessary to describe here. Even sights and sounds have been fetishes with some people. As far as I know, the only one of the men whose characters are examined in this book who was a fetishist was the one who has particularly interested me, Napoleon. He perhaps illustrates the fact that fetishism also reaches out in an opposite direction, that of acceptably normal sexuality, as in the sphere of preferred erogenous zones. I referred to this in Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor as follows. Unconscious influences from early childhood play a part in this, and in writing of breast and buttocks fetishism, psychologists point to the similar rounded smoothness of these areas and the importance of the mother's breast in the infant's early life. Learned discussion of this sexual symbolism has been taken over by the popular press in more colloquial terms, and we read of bosom men and bottom men, the former being the preferred type in the United States, where the idea is a well-filled sweater. In Latin countries, a similarly, difficulty with that word for some reason, similarly, well-filled pair of slacks, a similarly well-filled pair of slacks must move fast if it is to escape a pinch. Obviously, homosexuals will be bottom men, and Clifford Allen writes that they are often excited by tightly clothed buttocks. What a slap-happy time they must be having in these days of tight jeans for all sexes. If their deviations include sadism, then the buttocks are equated with the breast, and so pain is inflicted on the buttocks. The bachelor schoolmaster who would never interfere with boys, but gets his sexual pleasure from beating their bottoms. What? Is a well-known figure in British school life. What the fuck? Oh, man. When we turn from the general to the particular, it will be well to remind ourselves that all the men whose characters and sexual inclinations are examined in this book lived and died in the dark days before so much illumination was focused upon these problems. This should incline us to sympathy rather than condemnation. Who knows? Maybe the first person that started spanking school kids was a pervert. The aim of this introductory chapter has been to prepare the ground for the stories of some well known men in history. I hope that it may also be of interest to any whose lives, pardon, the coffee's going through me, that may be. I hope that it may also be of interest to any whose lives are unnecessarily complicated by misunderstandings about the curious ramifications of our sexual feelings, and that it may help to exorcise the lingering ghost of the old-styled schoolmaster and other misinformers of youth. In one of his less controversial utterances, Mr. Enoch Powell said, "I cannot help believing that if people talk nonsense for long enough and endeavor to act upon that nonsense for long enough, they will do themselves a serious injury. If nonsense about sex is peddled in the hearing of the young, it is they and not the peddlers who may suffer the serious injury." All right. There's your book, Chapter 1. Goodbye, bros. Goodbye.